It's been a busy day in Parliament today, Federal Parliament in Canberra. The pandemic has been front and centre. We're joined from Parliament House now by the Assistant Finance Minister Zed Seselja. Thanks for joining us, Zed. I kicked off the program by showing how Anthony Albanese is attacking the federal government over aged care outcomes. I think that's a legitimate attack. Your government has questions to answer, along with state governments and aged care providers. I don't think enough was done early enough. We didn't learn the lessons early enough. But it's hard for Anthony Albanese to be critical of Canberra when he won't even concede how badly Daniel Andrews has stuffed up everything on this issue in Victoria.
Well, that's a very good point, Chris, and a couple of points. And what we saw in question time today, both the House and the Senate, was one, very dishonest attacks by the Labor Party. So, you know, if they're genuinely concerned about keeping the government accountable, they wouldn't need to resort to blatant lies, which they did, claiming that we've cut aged care when there's been a significant, massive increase in the commitment and the spending on aged care support under the term of our government. But secondly, and as you rightly point out, they wouldn't ignore the context that we are dealing with. Now, where there have been mistakes made, the Commonwealth has owned up, we've apologised. There is no doubt that there are many people suffering, and those in particular who have lost loved ones in aged care are right at the top of that list, and our hearts go out to them. But we've been working very, very hard to get on top of those. But what Labor ignores is the context, which is the massive outbreak in Victoria, the fact that when you see significant community transmission in other parts of the world, we do unfortunately see it get into aged care. Now, we've been spared the worst of that, though, of course, what has happened has been tragic. So, yeah, real dishonest. One, I think, to play with the numbers, but two, really to run a protection racket for Dan Andrews, who, you know, let's face it, we've seen some pretty significant failings by the Victorian government, which is why they're dealing what they're dealing with right now.
Well, this has also spelled the end of the bromance between Scott Morrison and Daniel Andrews, with Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, attacking what's gone on in Victoria yesterday and Scott Morrison getting into it today as well. Here's what Daniel Andrews has said in response today.
Oh, we talk often. We send messages to each other often. As he said today, we don't necessarily agree on every matter, but we're working very closely together. He doesn't have to deal with these sorts of issues, and there are a whole lot of things that are on his plate that I don't have to deal with.
Daniel Andrews there. Look, he can't pretend away the mistakes in Victoria, and that's what I'm criticising Anthony Albanese for doing. But when it comes to aged care, we knew as early as February that it was really the elderly that were the vulnerable people when it came to this pandemic, Zed. We knew, of course, aged care centres would be the really vulnerable institutions. We'd seen that in northern Italy. We've seen that in the UK. We saw it in New York City. Some of those steps that are being taken now, compulsory masks for workers in the centres, not having people shift from working in multiple centres, making sure that you get patients who are infected out of the centres into hospitals quickly. It's good that this is being done now, but it's absolutely true that most of this could have and should have been done back in February or March.
Well, look, we've been taking action right throughout, whether it's over the last few years, whether it's through acknowledging that there were problems in aged care and calling the Royal Commission, or whether it's through the additional supports that have been provided right throughout this crisis. So we're not going to pretend that every response has been absolutely perfect. It hasn't. But I think in terms of providing resources, in terms of surge capacity, in terms of PPE and other things, in terms of working with state and territory governments, we have been throwing absolutely everything at it. So we do acknowledge the vulnerabilities there. But it must be said that it is, where there are significant community outbreaks, it is very difficult, and we have, relative to virtually every other country, done well both overall and indeed in aged care. But that's not to downplay where there have been outbreaks and the serious consequences of that.
Yeah, Zed, as Assistant Finance Minister, I'd love to talk to you about how we're going to deal with the debt, but we've only got about 40 seconds left on show. We've got to at least pull back the spending on pandemic measures, don't we? In other words, we need to open up our economy and our borders as soon as possible.
without a doubt, and obviously we're now moving to a scaling down of some of these support measures. So that's an important part of it. But then we need to grow the economy. You're absolutely right. And of course, over time, these border closures coming down is going to be an important part of that. And then there's a whole range of other improvements we need to make to the way we do things in our federation that'll get our economy moving again. We are doing that. We're seeing some recovery, but there's a hell of a long way to go. You're right.
Zed, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.